We have Anton, who just recently got a SSHRC Insight grant. And I've asked Anton because his research, I think, uses a largely qualitative research methods. We wanted to try to represent research that use different kinds of methods today. I got a SSHRC Insight grant a couple of years ago to study early intervention in writing. And my proposal is quantitative and experimental, so I'll be giving a bit of information about that application or application from that perspective. And then I've also asked Deanna to speak today because Deanna has recently been on the adjudication panel for SSHRC Insight development grants. And so she's familiar with grant review during COVID and the particular issues around that. So let's begin, and I'll ask Rachel to start off.
Okay, thanks, Terry. Hi, everyone. It's nice to see you. I've been alone in this room a lot lately. When Perry invited me to talk today, there were a couple of ideas that I just want to set out in terms of context. So how I've decided what I will share with you. What I'm going to be talking about today is predicated on the understanding that everybody here has already read the SSHRC Insight website, and that you have also, in looking at that website, you have looked at the rubrics that the adjudication committee uses to evaluate those applications. And so that's kind of the background knowledge that I hope that you have. I think that what I'm going to say today will make the most sense if you've done that reading. If you haven't done that reading yet, that is absolutely vital reading. And in fact, I would even suggest that you print out those little rubrics and that you stick them on your wall when you're writing, because they really do need to be your guide. They are absolutely, positively what we use when we are adjudicating. So they're not there as suggestions. They are everything to the adjudication panel. Okay, so what I'm wondering here is if I would be able to share my screen. Okay, do that. Okay. So with any luck, right now, you're looking at a slide that says know who and what you're thinking with and show it. Excellent. So in thinking about grants, what I would like to suggest is that we think about composing a grant as opposed to grant writing. And what I mean by that is that the grant is something, it is, in some ways, it is the product of a whole lot of thinking and a whole lot of work. So if you have an idea and you sit down and you write it up and you hand it in, we can usually tell that when we are adjudicating. If this is something that is coming out of a program of research, you know, if this is a study that's coming out of a program of research, that is something that has been building and that you have been building towards for you know, a good amount of time, and it fits within the work that you have been doing, and you can show a trajectory of what you will be doing, that is something that really shows. There's a maturity to the idea there. So before I get into looking specifically at the grant application, I would like to just highlight a few ideas related to this idea of composition and really thinking with ideas and your work as a program of research. So the first thing, I would be really remiss if I didn't highlight right from the start here that we are, all of us at Western University, we are working within a settler colonial context where we have responsibilities of research. And these are not just responsibilities that might come from, oh, I think I have a responsibility. These are actually mandated responsibilities. And there are many responsibilities that are given to post-secondary institutions from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's and the calls to actions. We really need to be thinking with those, and they need to be foremost for us. And they're not a checklist. What they are is a way of thinking with what are we compelled to do as researchers, given these responsibilities that we have. And so, for example, if you look at the TRC, you can see that there are calls to actions related to professional development and training for public servants. We are, as university professors, we are public servants. There are also myriad calls to action related to education for reconciliation. So within my own work, for example, right now, I've been working very closely with calls to action related to rights to Indigenous language. And that doesn't necessarily mean that I may write specifically about rights to Indigenous language, but it does mean that when I'm working within English literacies, that I have to be thinking about those English literacies in relation to linguistic rights. And so all of this kind of goes into those responsibilities, and also, you know, knowing what your gifts are and why you do what you do. So I hate to think about a grant application as simply a mechanical kind of process, or the act of doing research as some kind of, you know, 9 to 5 clock in and clock out job. Absolutely, you know, we have a job to do. There's no doubt about that. But we think about our research and our studies within this context of again, these programs of research and what we are compelled to do. So having that sense of why that is and that context in which you're doing that work is really important to composing a study. Also, starting early. So when I was talking about how we can see the difference when we're looking at a grant in terms of maturity, you can be thinking about how can you show that you've applied for, you've received seed money. That's very, that's important, and our research office has made all kinds of seed money available to us to be able to help us to show how this study is maturing. Pilots are very important. We need to be always working and training graduate students so that we can then, when we get to that grant application, we can show that we have done that work, that we know how to do that work, that we have these students who are already, in the queue to go. We need to show also that, that we have experience mobilizing knowledge to and with diverse audiences, that we have collaborators, if we're going to bring in collaborators, if we're going to bring in CIs into our grant or research assistants, being able to show that you've worked with these people and that you have a method for collaboration really, again, shows a mature application. Also, when we're composing, we want to honor existing great stuff that's already there. So that means disseminating through channels that already have audiences. So a frequent dissemination strategy that I've seen again and again in applications that are not as strong as others is, oh, we're going to make a website, and we're going to and so that's not a very we can be more thoughtful and mature in terms of the infrastructure, right? With that. So a one-off website, how do we get traffic? How do we build that? How do we get an audience? If we can show that we're already working in something, or that we're partnering with something that already has an audience, that's fantastic. Again, in terms of that knowledge mobilization, having those collaborations already in queue are really wonderful. And being also respectful to the research that has gone before. So we are often told you need to find a gap and say what's wrong with the existing research. Some of the best applications are those that do not discount the important knowledge that has gone before and upon which this application is based, but instead says, here is how I'm going to be contributing to what has come before. Here is how this might be different, but again, being very respectful to the audience. And also, you know, own what you've done and what you know, and make that visible. I also say that when we're trying to recognize what we're thinking with, respecting the community. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, first it means that you're going to have diverse readers. So your adjudicators are going to be coming from a whole bunch of different areas. Not everybody is going to be coming from your area, okay? And so you want to be respectful to the diversity of readers who are going to be looking at this application. If you've had an unsuccessful application and you've received feedback, or if you have had people read your application, which all of us are going to highly recommend that you do that and that you have a diversity of readers look at it. You know, sometimes the knee-jerk reaction when we get feedback is to say, well, I guess, you know, they're wrong, or, you know, you can get a little ornery about that sometimes. Just let it sit for a minute. What it's telling you is that there's something that you can do better there. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you, like sometimes they'll say, you need to do this, and maybe you do need to do that. But maybe what you need to do is instead collate the feedback that you've had and start to look to see, okay, where is this application insufficiently clear? Or where is this idea insufficiently clear? Is this an issue of writing? Or is this an issue of conceptualization? Or is it in the, you know, in the interstices between the two of those things? And then what do I need to do? Because it's my problem if the audience doesn't understand. It's not their problem. So you have to take responsibility for that and be respectful to that feedback that you get. Also, look at existing resources. So for example, there are lots of really good writing and editing resources, including for budgets, looking at successful applications and constructing reverse outlines from them. So we, you know, in literacy studies, we always talk about write like a reader, read like a writer. And so when you look at a successful application, you want to actually look at how it's put together. And Perry's going to, I understand, is going to give you some step-by-step, some examples of some phrasing, for example, and so that you can see, you know, how is this actually put together. The other thing that I would highly, highly recommend, because we've got so much to read when we're on the adjudication committee, is it is very hard to edit your own writing. You fill in the gaps all the time for yourself. If you can, hire an editor. You want that application to be squeaky clean. You do not want a typo ruining the, you know, many, many hours that you have put into something. You will note that on the rubrics, there's nothing there related to grammar and punctuation and APA, but I can tell you right now that a super clean application is always going to read better and make those adjudicators happier than one that is mired in grammatical errors. That also goes for your budget. That budget needs to be clean. Like, add and re-add those numbers, okay? All right, next, know who will read your application and how. So, you are going to be asked to suggest assessors, and here's some advice for that. I have unfortunately, I have seen, you know, bad assessments. And I think some poor soul put this person's name down as a potential assessor and has no idea that this assessor just raked them over the coals. So a few things about when you pick that assessor, okay? And this goes for a grant application, it goes for a tenure application, it goes for any time that you have to recommend an assessor. Go for fair. Someone who's gonna understand your work, not necessarily the person who is like the bigwig or like the most prominent person in the field. There is nothing worth more than a nice, fair assessment to go with your application. And there's nothing that hurts you more than having some big name person say that they don't like your work, okay? And also ensure that there are no conflicts of interest, because you do not want to suggest an assessor that later something's gonna come up that there's a conflict of some kind. So go for fair, not a wild card, and not necessarily the biggest name in the field, unless that biggest name in the field happens to also be like a really fair adjudicator. And so how do you know this? Well, if you don't know, ask for advice, okay? Ask a more senior colleague for some advice. Also, pick your committee wisely. You are going to be asked which committee you want to adjudicate your file. Go with your scholarly home. Do not try to do something fancy. So one thing that I've seen sometimes is like people are like, oh, I wrote this application and it's interdisciplinary and you know, I'm trying something out that's a little bit new and it would be great to have an interdisciplinary panel. Maybe, but maybe not. Again, your disciplinary home is going to be most likely to have folks on it who are going to understand your work. So be very careful with that. I also say pick your composing wisely. So write like a reader. How are you helping your reader to make sense of what you're doing? Again, you're going to have lots of different people reading this, jargon free. It's very hard sometimes to see your own jargon. This is why we need to have a diverse group of folks who can look at your application before you actually hand it in. If you have key terms, okay, these key terms need to be very well spelled out. And if you don't have the space to spell them all out, get rid of them. That doesn't mean that they can't come back into the research itself, but remember, the grant application is its own genre and it needs to be intelligible to the committee. So don't try to do too much at one time unless you actually have the space to be able to explain it, okay? Now, use topic sentences, okay? Use sentence stems that match the language to the evaluation criteria, okay? All of those things. You don't have a lot of room, so you're going to want to use bold, italics, and headings, right? All of these are the breadcrumbs that help your readers, this diversity of readers, to get it, okay? So if you have room, things like bulleted lists, numbered lists, okay? Those are all really very important. Now, last three things here. You are going to be evaluated on challenge, feasibility, and capability. So a few little tips on that. In terms of your challenge, pick your project wisely. What you want to get across is, why this project? Why now? For whom? For whom is this project? Okay, and that, like right at the beginning, like your first little paragraph, and Perry's going to show you this. This is where you get this across. Why this project? Why now? And for whom? Okay? Next is feasibility. You want to pick each piece of the puzzle of this project that you're doing wisely. You want to show how each piece goes together and plot out that rhythm, the demands, and the resources. So what that means is, when you are looking at that budget, you want to go through your application and you want to say, okay, I need to accomplish X, Y, and Z. What are the resources that are required to accomplish X, Y, and Z? And then you want to cross-check and actually match that up. And you can do that in a nice little table in your budget justification. And that shows that you know what you're doing, that you're not just asking for things willy-nilly, but this is extremely planful. So you really want to do that. And you also want to make sure that each section of that application goes together with the other one, that there are no gaps or contradictions between them. So will your methodology, for example, actually respond to the research questions that you've put in there? And have you shown that really clearly? That methodology section is super important. Make sure that you have expressed the methodology so that the reader can see it and say, yes, that's doable. I can see what that person is trying to do, okay? Capability. Pick your team wisely. Why these scholars for this project and this audience, okay? So if you are thinking about what are the demands that are being placed on you as the PI to be able to do this project, you can then think, can I fulfill these demands? Do I need team members? Make sure that those team members fit really, really well, and that they are strengthening the application, and that there's a rationale for them being there. And sometimes you do have to have uncomfortable conversations. If you don't know what a person's CV might look like, that can be a little challenging to have to deal with, but I'm telling you, it's better to know before you put somebody on the team than later. You know, if you find out that the CV doesn't quite match up or doesn't quite, add something, then it's better to know beforehand. Okay, so I'm gonna leave it there, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I will share the PowerPoints with the research office, and on the last slide I have here just a few nice little sample resources that can help when you're thinking about these projects and putting these things out. And I added the last, Barbara Kamler's Relocating the Personal, a Critical Writing Pedagogy, because it doesn't tell you how to write a grant application. It actually is a book about being a writing teacher. But what that book did for me that was really, really helpful is it allowed me to separate my ego, I might say, from my writing, so that I could see the writing. I could have conversations about how to make that writing better. And I could have those conversations without taking it personally and being hurt by the feedback. The writing is just the writing, and it can always be better. And Barbara Kamler there, she does a really nice job of helping you to be able to see that. Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. What I'll ask is that if people have questions that are particular to Rachel's presentation, you would post them in the chat right now, and then we can see the questions and respond to those. Okay, while you're typing those, if there are any questions, one of the questions I've gotten in the chat is whether this is for graduate students or only faculty members. And graduate students are welcome to this session, and I think that what you hear today will be really useful for you as you're applying for awards and grants in general. What Rachel has talked about is SSHRC Insight grants, but a lot of what she has said would really apply to any kind of award that has a research component to it. So I think you will still get something valuable out of this workshop. Okay, I don't see any questions for Rachel. So next I'm going to turn things over to Anton Purviajah.
I think I have shared my slide, right?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, good. Thank you, Rachel. I actually would like to have those slide, your presentation. I'm also, I got some great insights from you being on the other side. One of the unfortunate parts of this round of SSHRC grants were that we didn't get a review of feedback. We just got the scores, and that was it. No written feedback. And I think Deanna would talk about that a little bit later, I think. I have some few notes about my experience in writing this grant, and I thought I would share that with you. One of the things that I did was, I got these frequent reminders from the research office uh, whether I was going to apply for the SSHRC grant, and I kept putting it off and off for a couple of years. First couple of years since I came to Western, and the reason for that is I wanted to prepare myself for that. I needed to know my community. Moving from the States, I really needed to know London well, and also the students or the participants that I'll be working with really well before I go ahead and start applying for the SSHRC grant. So in order for me to do that, I applied for the Faculty of Education internal grants, and also the SSHRC seed grant from the university. And I think that prepared me really well to situate myself with a pilot study. And I was able to leverage the pilot study, the results from the pilot study, in applying for the SSHRC grant. And so one of the things that I would stress is that we need to plan really well and prepare early in terms of applying for the grant. And we need to really be thinking about whether we will be competitive in doing this, or whether we need to do a pilot or something else before actually going ahead and applying as well. What I did was, when I did decide, that this is it's my turn to, apply for this for the SSHRC grant. Early enough, I think about 6-7 months before, I started maintaining a Word document, just as a dumping ground from notes and whatever else, workshops, all these things that come across my mind. Instead of keeping it kind of floating in your mind, what I did was, and I jotted things down, so it I didn't have to think too much about it. And slowly later on, what happened is, I turned those things into a more or less a rough outline of the proposal material. So the outline would look like, what would be my, project goals? What would the context look like? How would my project be, informed by theory? And, what kinds of methodology or methods? So these were really rough at the very beginning, but, I didn't sprint to the end. But I was working through these things, each one of these sections, over 3 or 4 months, and that made my life a little bit saner, I think. Just instead of rushing to the at the very end. And the other thing in terms of planning is thinking about who I think Rachel mentioned this too, who your co-PI or collaborators are going to be. You need to be thinking about that early enough. And really be talking to them as well, and how they're going to be contributing to the project. You shouldn't think of it as a return of favor, for example, just because they listed you on a grant. Maybe it's your turn to list them on a grant, but it's actually needs to be a true collaboration or a true partnership with your co-PI. Same thing goes with identifying potential postdocs, and when you're thinking about graduate students, you also need to be thinking about what roles and responsibilities would the graduate students have in the proposal, and also how many graduate students, keeping in mind, of course, the budget that's available as well. I attended a number of workshops related to knowledge mobilization presented by the research office, and I found that very useful. I think there was also some resources available online through the SSHRC website that I found useful in terms of knowledge mobilization. We can think of many different ways how knowledge is mobilized, but I've reviewed a number of proposals, and we and these proposals tend to stick to the traditional forms of knowledge mobilization, conference presentations and journal articles. But there are so many other novel ways of mobilizing knowledge, and we need to be thinking about that as well. The expected outcomes is the other part that I was thinking about as well. Initially, when I went into this, I wanted to be clear what SHRC meant by expected outcomes, and also how is it different from the outputs. And I wanted to make sure those were clear. And one of the things that I wanted to mention here is that the expected outcomes part is not necessarily part of your narrative, but there's also a different section for it. Sometimes, at least for me, my mode, the mode that I work is, well, let me, finish the narrative, and then let's, worry about the, online completion at the end. And that's not going to work here for sure, because the online, form completion is actually quite substantive here with the in the research portal. For example, you need to put in the expected outcomes and the knowledge mobilization in a separate online form. And you need to be working on that early enough. And then what I did not realize is, and I actually, wrote my expected outcomes, scholarly benefits, societal benefits, and also benefits to the audience. And then when I go in there, and then I realize it's only 1,000 words or characters. I can't even remember, I think. So you need to also make sure that, it need to be quite short. These things need to be quite short. Then I had to go back and cut it down. So you need to be prepared for that. So one of the things I was not prepared is actually to cut down on these things, because I worked on a Word document. I thought, well, I'll just plop it in. Then I go and realize that there is a word limit, and it's actually quite short. The other thing I was planning in terms of, this is all in the planning stage too, is the timeline for the proposal. Whether it's 1 year, 2 year, how is it going to be split in terms of budget and also project activities. The completion of the Canadian Commons CV was a very tedious activity for me and also for my co-collaborator. Do not leave it to the very end. You need to be starting it, even if you're not even thinking about applying for the a SHRC grant, work on it. It'll just sit there, and then you can keep updating it, because it's quite tedious. So I would say that preparing and thinking about any kind of grant application, Tri-Council grant application, to work on that CCV. Also, keep in mind that the SHRC deadline is different than the deadline that we have internally at the faculty level and at the university level. So I think it's important for us to make sure that the applications are submitted to, let's say, Sonia's office, Carrie's office, before at least a week, I think, before the deadline.
Yes.
And Rachel mentioned this, read the proposal guideline and attend this SHRC webinar. What I found useful was reading the proposal guideline first and then attending the webinar. I found it very, it was more useful for me to know the guideline, have read the guideline before attending that webinar that was offered by SHRC. And if you have the chance to review other folks' grants, that will help you with hopefully with your own writing as well. A couple more slides. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the proposal narrative itself. SHRC wanted us to possibly focus on one or more of the 16 future global challenges. And so there's a nice website indicating the future global challenges. And in my proposal, I think I was able to identify 2 global challenges that tied really well. guys, I'm so sorry. Somehow I got cut off. Am I back online? Am I sharing my screen? Probably not. Just hang on a second.
I got two, but I'm back.
Yeah. I think I'm back online. I think I left off with talking about having a sensible timeline, and talking about, make it sensible, but make it also feasible. Don't be too ambitious for the time that you have to do your project. Too many points of collecting data or whatever else is going to, your reviewers are going to be questioning your feasibility and whether you're going to be able to accomplish all the things that you've said. So make sure the timeline is sensible. I didn't know this, I came up with, I was just looking, preparing for the presentation, and the timeline that I actually put in my proposal is called some kind of a chart, Jant chart. Yeah, I didn't know the term, but there it is. So if you look up on Google for this chart, it would be something like this, I guess. So this is what I had in my own proposal as well. I didn't know the terminology. Also be sure to have clear goals, but these goals need to be realized in the methods. So I think Rachel also alluded to this, when you have, research questions or goals, you can have that, definitely have those, but those things, all of those goals need to be realized in the methods and properly as well. And in the proposal, I thought it was necessary for me to communicate my capability, not just talk about research and how I will do it, but how I am capable to do this research. What is my background? How have you prepared to take on this project? What is my background in doing this, and how it ties to my research that I'm currently doing, and how it's going to help me move forward personally as an academic, as a researcher, but also within my own discipline as well. So I think I mentioned this already. A note on outcomes. Outcomes is different from outputs, and you need to fill this in the research portal. Be prepared for that. A couple of final thoughts. Yeah, don't forget there are other parts of the application other than the narrative. Don't leave them to the very end. And we mentioned this already, have someone else read the proposal and give you feedback, including Sonia at the research office. Thank you, Sonia, again, for reading my proposal and giving me feedback. And that's all I have.
Okay, thanks very much, Anton. If you have questions about Anton's presentation, could you post them in the chat, and I'll ask Anton to respond to them.
Harry, I'm just wondering if I could just add something to what Anton said. The SSHRC website is a beast, and it gets really, really busy. I actually have been involved with some grants where we were down to the wire and had to get some, I wasn't the PI, but where we had to actually get special dispensation from SSHRC to upload late because there was a snowstorm and all the power went out. And so I mentioned that just because, like, you want to get that stuff online as early as possible. Like, even the thought of waiting like the week before makes my stomach kind of get a little flippy floppy. Like, conquer the website as soon as you can. That's my advice.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. I see there's a question in the chat from Ruslan Suvarov. Do you want to talk about that, Anton?
Yes, sorry for the lag. I just need to find the mute button. Yes, Russ. So, I think others can jump in here as well. So other than publications and conferences, I think SSHRC is also looking for ways of mobilizing knowledge that reaches the general public, policymakers as well, who may not be attending conferences or reading journal articles. So it could be, I shouldn't say simple as, but it could be a good web presence, a good social media presence, having community workshops, and also drop-in nights, for my programs, and I have, parent nights as well, where parents can drop in and learn more about, what we do. So those are also, different forms of knowledge mobilization as well. I know our faculty are involved in, also doing, radio spots and things like that as well. Those work really well too, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Anton.
I could just jump in a second, Perry. If you want to know more about that knowledge mobilization piece, the main campus research office has people whose job it is specifically to engage in knowledge mobilization and to support that. So your ability to connect with them, both in terms of what the knowledge mobilization might look like, and also how you can already leverage things that Western already has, is sometimes quite helpful, and shows that it's not sort of just a one-off, as Rachel was talking about, in terms of creating your own website, that can you go through somebody else's website.
Okay, thank you for that. Okay, can everyone see my screen? Okay, thanks. Okay, so I'll talk about some things that I've learned about what you can do to strengthen a SSHRC Insight grant application. And what I'm going to say here has been informed by feedback I've gotten from reviewers on my own applications, but also reading successful and unsuccessful applications that come through our research office, as well as serving as a reviewer on other applications. Something I would really emphasize is explicitness. And in particular, when we're asked about originality, significance, expected contribution to knowledge, being specific about the sense in which your research will make an original contribution. Rachel talked a little bit about this, but what's valuable is if you can say specifically what's being done in the previous research, and then how your own research will build on that. And then once you've identified your particular hypotheses and research questions, using those as threads to tie together all the different parts of the detailed description. Like a reviewer should be able to follow through from your literature review to your research questions, and then those research questions should directly give rise to your method, and your method to your analysis. In terms of previous literature review, a question we get sometimes is it okay to include older studies? And I think the answer to that is it's useful to include both very recent studies to show that you're familiar with the current literature, but also early, widely cited studies that have kind of defined the theory or set the context for research in the discipline is valuable. Something you can do in a literature review, particularly if you're working in an area that has a lot of experimental or quantitative research, is to reference a meta-analysis. Meta-analyses integrate the results of lots of previous studies, and they often identify issues that haven't been investigated yet in your discipline. And so something really valuable is if you can point to a recent meta-analysis and say, in this survey of research, an issue that hasn't yet been studied is this one, and then say, and now my proposal is addressing that. A few of the things I was about to say Rachel has already covered, so to be concise, I'll just skip over those. Method, be as explicit and concrete as you can in the space that you're available. I think one of the differences we've seen between more successful applications and less successful applications is a specific, explicit, concise description of what you're actually going to do in your research. What data will you collect and how will you collect it? I think a trap that some researchers fall into is using most of their detailed description just for literature review and theory, and not getting on into what research they'll actually do. I would say of the unsuccessful proposals that we've seen, that's one of the two kisses of death. And Deanna's nodding her head, right? Because she's been on the other side of the table. And I'll talk about the other kind of fatal flaw that we see sometimes in a moment. Thinking about a timeline or a flow chart to describe your research program, I think this can be valuable, particularly if you have a longitudinal study, or if you have a series of experiments, or if you have a complicated experiment or design that will help the reader to follow it. If you're using quantitative research methods, something I found that reviewers respond to positively is the statement on statistical power. And I try to keep that concise by just making kind of blanket statement about my different studies. So for example, with n equals 120, assuming a small to medium effect size, statistical power will be over 90% for main effects, 75% for interaction effects, and then just say that will apply to all of the studies in this proposal. Explicitly showing the quality of the method. If you can make a kind of meta statement about why you've pursued your methods in a rigorous way, I think that can be helpful for reviewers. And I've had reviewers comment positively on this. So for example, if there's a previous literature review that's looked at the quality of research in your area and made recommendations about how research should be done, if you can cite that, that's great. Or if you have a book chapter or a journal article that lists the kind of look-fors that are appropriate to your research method, if you can cite those and quote those and then say those are built into these studies, that's something that can be helpful. In terms of demonstrating your capability and the feasibility of the research, if you can explicitly state that you've used similar methods or research instruments in the past and done that successfully, then that's helpful. And then as Anton and Rachel mentioned, showing that this is part of a research program, for example, that you've already done pilot research, I think adds to the credibility of your proposal. Research teams, Rachel has already talked about this. And I think that what she said was dead on. I think something that I've seen reviewers really look for is there a good rationale for this set of people on your team? And I think what they want to see is a team that has complementary expertise that suits the project that you're proposing. So not necessarily everyone having exactly the same expertise, but bringing different pieces. For example, in my research right now, we're working with grade 1 writers. And so the PI on that research is me. My main co-investigator is Lisa Archibald, and she specializes in research on young children's language development. So she brought some expertise that was different from mine, but complementary to it. Concrete evidence of the success of team members, I think, is also helpful. Evidence-based bragging. One of the things we see in lots of research proposals is a statement about the strength of the researcher or the qualifications of the researcher. And I think that can be valuable, but it's important to tie it directly to achievements that show your competence related to the research you're proposing. So for example, a kind of generic statement we see a lot in my office is, Dr. X is a leading international scholar. But what that sounds like when a reviewer reads it is like, Tide is a new and improved laundry detergent, right? It doesn't really say anything. And so what's more helpful is if the researcher can say something in particular that shows their qualifications, like, for example, you know, they've been cited a certain number of times, or they've been a keynote speaker at conferences, or they've had a chapter that's with an internationally recognized publisher, all of those sorts of things. Same thing with graduate supervision. It's not really helpful if someone says they're an outstanding graduate supervisor, but what's helpful is if you can say you've supervised X MA students, X PhD students, for example, that you've published with your students, or your students have published from their theses or from their theses in the past, that's great. So yes, be self-promoting, but it all has to be immediately tied to some facts. Something that you'll see is really emphasized in SSHRC Insight grants is training HQPs, or as we used to call them, graduate students, highly qualified personnel. And this is something that I think it's useful to connect throughout your proposal. So for example, in your team section, if you can say something about the graduate students with whom you're working, then in the training section, that's probably the most important for HQPs. If you can say concretely what you're going to do to support training those students. Then in your budget justification, that should match your training section and your team section. So for example, something SSHRC Insight is interested in is students getting international opportunities. So if you can show that they're going to have, that you're building in budget for your graduate students to attend an international conference, then that can connect back to those other pieces. And then again, when you're talking about your own research contributions, if you can also say you've supervised students who have published. So the idea there is, in terms of HQPs, is that there's a section about it, but really it's something you should be touching on in a coherent way throughout the proposal. I'd really encourage you, as you're doing your SSHRC proposal, to pay attention to the LinkedIn pages about specific topics. Like, for example, SSHRC has a page on training HQPs, and it stresses that idea of, you know, what will they learn? Concretely, how will they help you, how will you help them to learn it? And then there are some other interesting points that have become more prominent in recent years with SSHRC. So for example, one of the things they say is it's likely not possible for the supervisor or applicant to provide training in all of the skills listed above. And so what other opportunities might you facilitate for them or make them aware of that could also contribute to their training? Like, just to give one example, we have a graduate student research day. And so you could encourage your student to participate in helping to organize and participate in that. That's just one example. In terms of training HQP, something that I've had reviewers respond to positively is being concrete about that. And so that includes things like what will those HQPs be learning? And then concretely, how will you help them to learn it? So for example, will you pair them with a more senior graduate student for some mentoring? Will you do a workshop or weekly research meeting with your students? Like, concretely, what will you do? Something that used to happen in the old days that some people still do is they tell their philosophy of graduate education. And these philosophies all sound the same, right? Everybody says, I believe in a constructivist student approach to graduate ed. Nobody ever says I'm an authoritarian supervisor who punishes my students if they don't do what I say, right? So all of those statements sound the same. And I think what's more valuable than that is concretely a description of how will you work with your graduate students. Yeah, and then that idea of costs, including costs for students to attend conferences. Oops. Budget and budget justification. You have to be really concise with this. The more concrete detail you can build in, the better. You can work with our research office for help with that. And also I would encourage you to build in an in-kind contribution, and you can work with our research office about that. Anton mentioned earlier the deadlines in the university and the Faculty of Education around proposals, and that's correct. And then something that I think is even more important than that is not so much the deadline as the working early on with the research office, because what we'll try to do is help you build that budget from the beginning. Knowledge mobilization plan. The other speakers have already talked about this. And again, what I'd encourage you to do is really carefully read the links within the SSHRC Insight Grant application about effective knowledge mobilization. As the other speakers have already mentioned, this is really about more than journal articles and book chapters now. And in particular, there's an encouragement for interactive activities that will engage with audiences, and even including your potential audiences early on in the research process, in things like the planning of the research, right? What you'll see more of in our faculty, and an increasing amount of in our faculty, is engaged research, in which faculty members work together with members of the community to plan research. And that kind of thing is something that SSHRC values. In terms of knowledge mobilization, as Anton said, there's lots of potential audiences, and we're asked to talk about ways of communicating with them. So I did that with a table. The language in this table is a bit dated now. And the new language is around audiences. What audiences will benefit first, then how will they be involved, and when, and then how will the audience benefit, and how will your research benefit, so the idea of a kind of mutual benefit there, and then the best way in which to communicate with those audiences. And so, you know, I would suggest considering setting that up as a table, because really what you have there is a matrix of issues, right? There are those different audiences, like other researchers, members of the public at large, professionals, policymakers. That's sort of your, those could be kind of the rows in your table. And then the columns are like, how will you communicate with them? What will be the benefit? When will you communicate with them? And so on. So table seems to be something that was well received. Response to previous critiques. The earlier speakers have mentioned this. Something I would add is the space for responding to previous critiques is quite brief, and there's not really room to describe a sort of internal dialogue with them. So the way I've done that in the past, like for example, this proposal that I got most recently, it had previously been rejected. And the reviewers had different specific concerns, but the one that was really a big concern for them was that I wanted to hire a research associate who is an experienced teacher who could support our project. And SSHRC most prefers to support graduate students. And that was the main reason that my first proposal was rejected. So I tried to build in like a concise response to that in writing back to them. They also raised some detailed methodological questions. So what I did was I tried to concisely respond to those, and then just in brackets to indicate who I was responding to, R1, R2, R3 for the 3 reviewers. So some general considerations. I said earlier that I think there are 2 things that really get people, that are real killers for proposals. And the one I mentioned earlier was not describing the method. The other element that I think is a real risk is when people try to do everything. It's important that, yeah, both of the reviewers are nodding, right? Because we see this. An important part of the challenge is having a challenge that that's novel and so on, but also manageable, something with a scope that you can actually address. So try to have that kind of 1-sentence proposition about what the overall purpose of your research is, and make sure that it's something that you're really addressing in your method. Something that the other speakers have already talked about, and I would encourage this too, is be absolutely shameless about using the terms from the call in your own response. Like, just go ahead and use those terms like feasibility, challenge, capability, and even highly qualified personnel. right? Because the researchers need to be able to find all of that stuff. And I would really echo what Rachel said about using subheadings and bolding in order to help reviewers find those elements in your proposal. Because what will make things easy for them is if they sort of have their physical checklist or their mental checklist and they're going through your proposal and they can find where you've addressed each of those elements. Again, I would just underscore, keep in mind the emphases of the Tri-Council. The Tri-Council is very concerned with what's your contribution to knowledge, but also how will you train HQPs and how will you mobilize knowledge. So really attend to those. Be concrete. Wherever you can, be concrete, like whether the issue is method of training HQPs or whatever. And then in claims about your past success, be evidence-based. Okay, and then the final thing I would say is step up to the plate and apply again. If you've been unsuccessful in the past, one of the things we've seen in our office is that if people are unsuccessful with one application, but they resubmit, they often succeed on the second try or on the third try, particularly if their proposal is generally good. And I think if they meaningfully address the concerns of previous reviewers. When you address the concerns of previous reviewers, you're getting different reviewers the next time, and they may have the same concerns or different concerns. But I think if you think of your reviewers, as Rachel said, as giving you issues that you need to help them understand, then those may be the same issues that other reviewers will also be interested in subsequently. Okay, so with that, I'll stop sharing my screen. And I will, I'll take a couple of specific questions. And then I'll turn things over to our next speaker. I see that Melody has a question about how international partners have been viewed as compared to Canadian partners. And I think I'll put that question actually over to Rachel and Deanna. What's been your experience, Rachel, as a panel member in response to international collaborators? I see Deanna's already responded, right? Yeah, Rachel?
Oh, I can respond if Rachel wants a moment. I think for me, we didn't really have a discussion sort of specifically isolating international partners. I think Perry's point is well taken, that it really is the complementary skills that people bring to the project that's of most importance. I think one of the things you want to be mindful of is sometimes people will put how much time people are going to spend on the project, the relative time in terms of the PI versus their collaborators. And that sort of adds to the feasibility piece. That is, does this person have enough time to actually engage in the project? What will their specific roles be? And how will that allow the project to unfold? I think for me, one of the things that was potentially a problem with collaborators was when the collaborator was too closely associated with the PI, particularly when it was an emerging scholar. So you couldn't see them sort of getting out of the shadow of their previous supervisor. That's where people on the committee tended to have a greater issue with collaborators. But in terms of the international piece, though, there wasn't really discussion of it.
Deanna, is that for insight development or insight?
That's insight development.
Yeah, I'm curious about at the insight level if there's been any question around that, because the research seems, over a longer period of time, more in depth, you're less likely to be working with your supervisor in that context, I would say. So I'm specifically wondering, for example, we can have your international collaborators, they are not able to be funded for some things in SSHRC, but they are for others. And so I wondered in the review process, though, if there was any discussion, for example, around conference travel for international. I can't remember what the included criteria are, but Rachel, have you seen any discussion around that at the Insight review table?
So relative to the international status, that was not an issue, as Deanna has said, for the IDG. It was really, those other questions about, how are they going to be contributing? Does it make sense for them to be there? And so I wouldn't worry about that at all if the other pieces are there. One thing with the insight that I want to say about collaborators that I have seen is sometimes in the weaker applications, they may have been weaker because the project leaned too hard on collaborators. So that's the other thing that you want to really watch, is the status of the of the folks in the application. So if you have somebody who is a collaborator, that project cannot lean very hard on a collaborator. So if it does that, then you need to ask yourself, does this person need to be a CI or a collaborator? And also be thinking, and this is where the strategic part comes in, those CVs are being highly scrutinized. You want to make sure that you are using the best of what you've got. So if you have somebody, let's say, who, really might be contributing quite a bit in a particular area, and that might even just be in terms of their expertise with, a given method of analysis or something like that, and they have a really fantastic CV, you might want to have a conversation with them and see if that person is best placed as a CI as opposed to a collaborator, because the collaborator CVs don't really count.
They don't even show up. I think they're not able to.
No, you don't get to evaluate them. So, and vice versa, right? Again, if you have, sometimes for whatever reason, you might want to do somebody a favor or whatever and put them on. If they're a junior scholar, that's absolutely fine if the CV is not that strong, because they're a junior scholar, right? And you're showing how you might be mentoring, and it's great to have people who are at different stages of career. But if there's somebody that it's a bit lukewarm and they're not really contributing that much, you might want to, I know this is I hate having to say this, but you might want to think about that. Similarly, if you are, this happened to me, so I will put this out there. This happened to me where we had a team, it was a good team, and the team had a conversation about who was going to be the PI. And there was somebody who really wanted to be a PI. And so we were like, be the PI. The feedback, that person was not senior enough to be the PI. That CV was not strong enough to be the PI, and we didn't get the grant. So, that's a hard lesson, but learn from it so that you don't have to go through it.
Okay, thanks for that, Rachel. There are a couple of other questions, but I want to turn things over to Deanna now to talk about reviewing during COVID. And then if we don't get to all of the chat questions, what I would encourage people to do is email those questions to me or to the other members of the panel to get a response. So Deanna, I'll turn things over to you now.
Thanks, Perry. I'll try to keep this brief. So I reviewed the Insight Development Grant and not the Insight Grant, which they sound the same, but they are not. But the Insight Development Grant review process happens in May. So at that point, you've been tasked to do this job, and then all of these policy pieces come down from SSHRC about what changes are going to happen to that process. So I would strongly encourage anybody who's thinking about applying for SSHRC this fall to go to a webinar that is run by SSHRC to ask specific questions about if there's going to be procedural differences because of COVID. I tried to go on the website to see if I could find anything, and most of the information there pertains to people who've already got SSHRC and what that means for them using their funds, and not so much the application process. But there were a number of things that changed in the Insight Development Grant that could possibly carry over into the Insight Grant. I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball to know that, but I think asking SSHRC those questions is really quite helpful in how you're crafting your project and what you hope to get out of the process. And the reason I say that is when I first applied for the SSHRC Insight Grant, I did so in the second year of my appointment, hoping I would get it. But if I didn't get it, I was hoping to get some good feedback from the assessors and from the panel. And I was fortunate enough to be successful, but I was hoping to then use that information going forward if I wasn't successful. And the reason I wasn't convinced I was going to be successful was that they had sort of, you know, it was my first go around and I didn't have any collaborators at the time that I was using. So one of the reasons I say that is one of the processes that changed for the SSHRC Insight Development Grant was we didn't give any feedback at all to the applicants who, except for their scores on the 3 criteria. So challenge, capability, and feasibility. And of course, the thing that's difficult there is if you fail any one of those 3 categories, if you get a failing score, then your proposal is automatically not qualified to be funded. And people could, you know, fail for various reasons, and they weren't, you know, informed as to why it failed in general. Now, in other cases, you might not get funded because there's not enough money and you just don't quite meet the cutoff line. But in some cases, it's because there was 1 or 2 points where the committee felt like, you know, it would be a fail, and people weren't getting feedback on that. One of the things I strongly encourage, as the reviewer, as the other speakers have encouraged here, is to have the research office take a look at your proposal, have peers in your field take a look, because they'll be able to hit those red flags. And so that you want to make sure you don't have a red flag that's going to automatically fail you. So minimal feedback. The second thing that happened because of COVID was we had to adjudicate thinking about feasibility as to whether or not people could actually do the project given the constraints of COVID. And so the instructions that we got were actually very minimal, to be honest. They weren't quite sure how to deal with COVID. So the biggest conversation was less about sort of the feasibility in terms of, say, people going to conferences, because we assume that at some point people will be able to go to conferences again and money can be spent there. But it was more around the challenge and whether or not the question itself could still be answered given COVID. And what I mean by that is, are there questions that you're posing that involve individuals getting together in a way that possibly wouldn't be something that could unfold over the next couple of years? And the issue with the grant that I reviewed was it was either a 1-year grant or a 2-year grant. And so it was challenging as a committee to sort of have those discussions. I'm not suggesting, so when you're thinking about your own feasibility and what your own questions are and your own challenges are, think about it in light of where we are to some extent, because that's a difficult question. The third thing that I just wanted to highlight, and this is different between Insight Development versus Insight, is that they reduced the number of readers on proposals, on grant submissions. So one of the things that we don't benefit from in Insight Development is external assessors. So I would hope that SSHRC will move forward and continue to have external assessors, but for the grant that I reviewed, typically there are 3 readers on a file. And what happens is you discuss that file for 10 minutes total, you decide on your final scores, and depending on where that person falls within the cutoff line to get funded, you're either above the line or below the line, and that's the decision. Because of COVID, they made the decision to go from 3 readers to 2 readers. And so what that means is the person for this particular grant. And so what that meant was that you really had to have your readers be champions of your proposal, right? You wanted the person who was presenting your proposal to the committee to really be able to give a 5-minute elevator speech to say why your project should be funded. So you really want to make sure you're selling that for your reader, because at least in the case here, you know, when you've got 2 readers, it's the one who feels more strongly that's probably going to sway any compromising that has to be done. And there's not that third voice that's going to come in to sort of find that middle ground. That being said, you know, that's what happened in the previous round of grants for SSHRC Insight Development. I strongly feel that the strongest grants were the ones that got funded. But if you're fuzzy on what you're saying, if you're not doing all these things that the previous presenters have talked about, it's quite easy. It has the possibility of not shining through as it needs to in order for people to want to be the ones to say, yes, we need to fund this, because you really do need somebody to say, yes, this is an excellent project. It will contribute. And I think, there's a possibility if somebody's sort of on the fence about that, they won't speak up in favor of your proposal, and you might not be as successful as you would like to be. So I think that's sort of the three things that I think COVID sort of impacted in the discussions that I was involved with.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Deanna. So there have been a couple of other questions that have popped up in the chat. Pejman had asked if it's a downside if you don't have any co-researchers, and Rachel has addressed that in the chat. Do you want to also comment on that, Deanna?
Sure. I'm right on board with Rachel. When I applied, I applied as an individual researcher, and it's basically the scope of the project that you're applying for. So you have to demonstrate that you're able to carry out that project independently without collaborators, and it should be based on how you've articulated your capabilities in the proposal itself and how it comes across in your CV. And if you don't think those two are strong enough to carry the project that you've proposed, then bringing on collaborators is really important. It's about finding the balance between a team that's going to feel like it's going to be able to carry out the project versus having a team that's either too thin or too bloated. We want to find that happy middle ground.
Yeah, thank you. Melody asked the question, do the reviewers see the previous reviews? And Deanna's commented for the SSHRC Insight Development Grant, they don't. And I think they also don't for the SSHRC Insight Grant. Is that correct, Rachel?
That's been my experience.
Good, thank you. Good. So I don't see any additional questions in the chat. Does anyone else have questions for the...
Perry, can I just ask a clarification then why you would indicate in your response to reviewers that you're responding to reviewer 2 or to reviewer 1?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it was giving, a feeling of concreteness that I was responding to someone in particular.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's like including dialogue in narrative.
Reviewer 2 said.
I also, there's something important that I'm sorry, I forgot, but I don't think we should leave without talking about it. And that's the special circumstances clause for insight grants. So there are a couple of, the grant asks you if you have any special circumstances. And so what they're looking for there is there anything that may have interrupted your productivity that you want the committee to know about so that they can be able to evaluate your CV more equitably. And so those, career interruptions could be things like parental leaves or medical leaves, or things of that nature. So that's really important to pay attention to. And though this is not going to be us here at Western, there are also some other special circumstances related to being at a small university where you don't have access to graduate students. And so just so that if anybody's anyplace else, just know that there are those circumstances. And for those folks who are newer, who are more junior scholars, the IDG is a really good, like I would put a plug in there for the IDG. We used to have SSHRC standard research grants, and we didn't have insight grants. And what you did was, if you were a new scholar, you indicated that you were a new scholar, but everybody applied for the same competition. Now there is the insight development grant and then the insight grant. And the insight development grant is for new scholars or for more established scholars who are wanting to pursue a new line of inquiry. So they might not have the same kind of research background that you would expect to be able to pursue this work. And so the IDG is a really good way to get your feet wet and then to go on later to apply for the insight. And I was going to say, especially if you don't have, I mean, not necessarily, but if you don't have a track record yet of graduate students, that might be something you want to think about. Or that would be a time when you'd want to bring in a co-investigator who has access to graduate students, because that HQP is very important. So pay attention to that.
Yeah, and Deanna wanted in.
Yeah, just to sort of build on what Rachel's saying there, particularly if you're new and your the Insight Development Grant has two different pockets of money, one for established researchers and one for emerging researchers. So you're competing with people in your same pool, so to speak, in that particular competition. So that becomes pretty important. And if you're already an established researcher, as Rachel pointed out, it needs to be a clear new path of research that you're doing. And I would suggest that if that's not clear, you're basically not off the starting block in that particular competition.
Yeah, thank you. Well, our time is almost up. Years ago when we had these types of workshops, what happened is someone would cut and paste material from the SSHRC Insight Grant website into a PowerPoint and put it up on the screen and read it to us. And we wanted to really get away from that. And so what I asked our panel members to do today was to use their experience to help people strengthen their applications by giving some suggestions for the do's and do nots of SSHRC Insight Grant applications. And I think the panel has done a fantastic job of that. I'm just going to open my reaction button here and clap for them. So thank you very much for that. I'd also like to thank Sonia Farimo for organizing the workshop today, and I'd like to thank Jennifer Heidenheim for hosting the Zoom session. Okay, thanks everyone. And if you have questions or anything we can help you with, please email the research office.